All right, I would say we continue. I hope you had a good lunch. Did you enjoy the food? Yeah, silence, so yeah, you enjoyed it. All right, it's a special pleasure to me to introduce to you Dennis, one of my teammates at EMW, and also Jiska from TU Darmstadt, who will present on their Bluetooth framework that they developed, Bluetooth analyzing framework, of course. One disclaimer before they start, if you don't want your Bluetooth ID to be seen during the presentation, then I would recommend you to turn Bluetooth off now. All right? Okay, please give a warm applause for those two guys to present.
Thank you for the introduction and welcome you all to our talk. My name is Dennis and I was working with Bluetooth for my master thesis. Basically what I did is I reverse engineered the firmware of a Bluetooth controller which was manufactured by Broadcom, and I did that to find out how it works and how it looks from a security perspective. But then at some point I found out that I was actually able to modify the firmware myself. So I decided to write a little experimentation framework so that also other researchers can use this knowledge to easily experiment with the firmware, basically. Jiska was my supervisor during my thesis, and she took over the work on this framework after I finished. And now she and several other students are still working on this and further developing the features and also finding more use cases and more interesting stuff in this firmware. So what we basically thought is it would be interesting to do a little research on Bluetooth firmwares. There are several things you might want to be interested in. For example, it's always good to dissect the firmware if you actually want to have a look at it from a security perspective. So this was what I had first in mind when I started my thesis. I wanted to see how well is the security of those firmwares, and I started with a Broadcom firmware because this was what I had at hand. Then, as I said, I found out that I was actually able to modify the firmware, and this opened up a whole new world of possibilities. So basically now we are able to leverage this fully featured and working Bluetooth implementation to be our very own experimentation platform where we can add new features and alter existing behavior, which is really nice. It almost feels like we can add kind of an open source touch to a closed source system, because those Bluetooth firmwares are usually not open source and you cannot see what they're actually doing. After all, we really like reverse engineering, so this was also another reason why we did that. We already did some similar projects in the past where we had great experiences with reverse engineering firmware. For example, some of you might know the Nextmon project. This was a project where we reverse engineered the firmware of Wi-Fi controllers, also manufactured by Broadcom. And this was also a big success. We could also modify the firmware of those. And other researchers took over the work. For example, Google Project Zero used this work also to develop some remote execution bugs on the firmware of Wi-Fi controllers, and they also referenced to this work. Now, before we really start to dig into how this firmware works, I want to first talk a little bit about Bluetooth to bring all on the same page, basically. Bluetooth is also a layered protocol stack, just as TCP/IP. We have different protocol layers, and the special thing about this is that it's basically divided into two halves. So the upper half is implemented in the host. So the host would be, in this case, an Android phone, for example, or an iOS system, Linux, Windows, or anything that has a Bluetooth stack and comes with Bluetooth support. And then the lower half of the stack is implemented inside the Bluetooth controller. And the Bluetooth controller is a dedicated chip on your main board, for example, or it also comes in form of little USB dongles you can plug into your system. And so the Bluetooth controller implements all the lower layers of the Bluetooth protocol, and there's a well-defined interface. This is called the host controller interface, which is used for communication between those two components in this Bluetooth system, the host and the controller. We will refer quite a lot to the HCI protocol. It's really important for our work. And what you should keep in mind is that this is a protocol used locally. So this will never be transmitted over the air. It's just used locally on one system to communicate between operating system and the Bluetooth controller. Another interesting protocol is, for example, the Link Manager protocol, the LMP. This one is implemented inside the Bluetooth controller, and manages the link to other devices. So for example, it manages connection setup to another device. It also manages pairing with other devices and setting up all the crypto parameters you need to have an encrypted channel between multiple devices. So this one is actually transmitted over the air. That's one of the main differences between those two protocols. What's also interesting is that the HCI protocol, because it's basically implemented on both sides, is actually observable from the host. So if you have a Linux machine with Wireshark installed, you can maybe just open up Wireshark, start capturing on your Bluetooth interface, and you will actually see HCI traffic. However, you will probably not see any LMP traffic because LMP is a protocol completely implemented inside the Bluetooth controller. It's also terminated on this layer, so none of the LMP packets will ever show up on the host side, and the host has no control over this protocol. And this is also one thing I wanted to change once I found out that I can actually modify the firmware, because this LMP protocol looks really interesting because it does pairing, crypto, and so on. Okay, one last thing to mention on this slide is, as I said, I developed a little experimentation framework, and the framework actually runs on my host computer, which runs Linux. The framework is written in Python, and it communicates with an Android phone over ADB. So basically, we have this Android debug bridge, which we use to communicate with the Android phone and also with the Bluetooth controller inside the Android phone. Just that you get not confused, the framework is running on a Linux machine, but we will use the Bluetooth controller in a phone. We are also working that we have support for other Bluetooth chips so that we, for example, could also use Bluetooth chips directly in our laptops and also maybe on the Raspberry Pi. Okay. Now, I will briefly explain or demonstrate all the features, and later we will go into more details. The framework is named Internal Blue. It's already open sourced. You can find it on GitHub if you like to try it. It's probably currently still supporting the Nexus 5 best, because this was the phone I was initially developing it on. But we're adding support for other platforms as well. So if you have some kind of Android phone, you want to try experimenting with it, and it has a Broadcom chip in it, you can maybe start and also come to us if you would like.
And the first Linux support is there already. So if you're not doing monitoring, but just want to do some special binary patching within Bluetooth, that's already working with Blues on Linux. So it's just listed on the website. So I did some pushes during the last days with new features.
Yeah. Also, if you're really interested in how this framework works internally, after I finished my thesis, I already gave a talk at another conference which goes more into the architecture of this framework. And there's a recording of this talk down at the bottom of the slide. There's also a link to the recording. So if you're interested in that, maybe if you want to start developing on using this framework, you can also refer to that. Okay, so in a nutshell, we are basically using vendor-specific HCI commands. So those are HCI commands that are only implemented by the vendor. In this case, it's Broadcom. And Broadcom implemented those commands, which we can now use. We found out how they are working, and they allow us to directly read and write to the address space of the chip. So this was a big success once we found that out, because the first thing I did was basically read out the firmware, which was a great starting point because now I could start reverse engineering on this firmware. But we can also write to the address space, of course, only to the RAM, not the ROM. As we found out later, there's also the possibility to patch certain things temporarily in the ROM. Broadcom also has some features for that. And once we had that, I started developing the framework so that we can use that in our tools. The framework is a Python module. You can use it in your Python scripts if you want to script something, or it also comes with a command line interface if you just want to do some hex dumps in the memory, call certain functions in the memory, or what we also developed as a first plugin basically was this LMP monitoring feature, which can also be invoked from the command line interface. This LMP monitoring feature is basically just a patch to the firmware so that the LMP traffic is duplicated inside the firmware and also transported to the host side so that we can actually monitor it in Wireshark. And we could also now inject arbitrary LMP packets into existing Bluetooth connections. So if we have this phone we pair it with another device. There's a Bluetooth connection now, and we can see every LMP packet that is going back and forth between those two phones, and we can also inject packets, which is quite nice for doing some experiments on Bluetooth. Then we also went one step further. We thought maybe it's also interesting to look at some old Bluetooth vulnerabilities that were around and see if we can actually implement a proof of concept, because now we can actually modify the firmware. We can take those vulnerabilities that were discovered, which was very hard to write POCs for it, because Bluetooth is a closed source system, at least the part that is implemented inside the Bluetooth controller. Now that we can modify the Bluetooth controller firmware, we can also maybe try to modify it so that it exploits some vulnerability. And the one I choose, I will demonstrate later, was the fixed coordinate invalid curve attack that was released right after I finished my thesis last summer, and basically allows to do a man-in-the-middle on the pairing sequence, but we will come to that later. And at some point, finally, we also found our own little crash of the firmware. So we were basically able to remotely crash the firmware, the firmware running on this Bluetooth controller without prior authentication, which is a DOS attack on its own. And after some messing around with that, we also got some limited code execution on some of the chips. It's not a full control of the chip, but yeah, it's interesting nevertheless. We can trigger some code paths that are not meant to be triggered over the air. Yeah.
Yep. So the reversing is actually very hard. I think you spent like half a year most of the time just looking in IDA, staring on hex code. And the problem here is that to save space, there's really nothing that is in there. There is no strings, no debug symbols, nothing. So it's not obfuscated, but it's also very, very strange stuff going on there. There is the documentation, so there's the Bluetooth standard. That's the good thing. I mean, they implement a standard, but they implement like almost 3,000 pages of standard, plus their own extensions. And then you try to dig for some strings and numbers and whatever, and then you start naming functions. So the blah, blah, blah function doing something with, I don't know, maybe LMP, maybe this is encryption. It has like this XOR with, okay. And then you go there. So what you can see in this figure over here is something that I produced with CodeCard, which tries to locate modules and then calls within modules to just, yeah, give me a starting point, which parts could be interesting, which parts get more calls, but it's still very messy. So I don't know, like half a year after, it looked like this. Yeah, we have some pointer to get a connection struct. That one is very important. That's in all the important functions we call the connection structs. Then there is like lots of vendor-specific HCI commands, not just the read and write RAM, but they are undocumented. And then you have something like, we know if we change the buffer here, then in the end, the frame that we will send will contain the parts of this buffer. So it's like, in the end, we will send the LMP buffer with this, but it's strange. So that's what we did for quite a lot of time. And that's what I also continued, just staring on this, spending full evening. It's great. And then it was almost Christmas. And people were like asking me, yes, but does it work on the newest device? And then I said, yeah, okay, maybe I should get the newest device. And the issue here is if you try to get something with a new Bluetooth chip, then you need to get the newest smartphone, which you then need to root and everything. That's a bit risky. This is what I did not want to do. So it's very expensive. But then I found out there's development kits. They are just something like 50 euros, and they have a very recent chip. Broadcom has been acquired by Cypress, so it's now called Cypress something instead of Broadcom something, but it's still the same mechanisms. I had that on my table, and then I was wondering. So these chips, they have an IoT application on it. So they are IoT application evaluation frameworks. So you can start like a temperature sensor app on this, and it has also the sensors. And then there's this app running on it, and I was asking myself, like, okay, if there's an app running on it, is it using the same basic operating system or something different? And I looked into the assembly that I extracted with the read RAM and so on, and I found out threads are created the same way. And so there must be some symbols, and then I looked a bit further, and then I found a very big symbol table having like 11,000 function names or something. So almost everything was named. So it was a bit more like this. Yeah. You finally have the correct names. And it's also very helpful. I mean, we have more code, some older ones and so on. But you will still get an idea. So you can do some bindiff. It's not always that good what you get as a result, but at least something. And if you find similar functions and have a starting point, then you can give things similar names and also get the differences. And there's really funny names like this super duper peak poke, whatever.
It's really named like this in the firmware.
Yeah, that's original firmware names, what you can see here. Also, some of them are not that nice. So this DHM LMP TX is just what we called send LMP packet. I don't know. But at least it's LMP TX, so that's what you can get from this. Yeah, so lots of fun. The next part is now that you have an idea of what is where, it's very nice to write patches in C. So everything that Dennis made was writing patches in assembly, which is still something, so you don't have to write hex code, but C is even nicer. And we have for Wi-Fi this other framework called Nexmon, and it's very generic binary patching. And we currently have this branch, Bluetooth work in progress on GitHub, where we have the first patch examples for C, but that one needs to be extended. So it's work in progress, and then you can also write some patches in C. So yeah, you can add, I don't know, aliens, gold, whatever. And the next part is that I then stumbled about that there's on Apple devices, on the older ones, you have the possibility to do LMP monitoring, and they have Broadcom chips, and it just works. And I was like, they probably don't do like an assembly patch like you did. Maybe they do it differently. I think this was the point like where you would have almost killed me because it did so much things, and then I just made it happening within 1 or 2 weeks. So what I found out, there's a Diagnostics protocol, and there's some parts left in this older Apple Bluetooth packet logger stuff. But then, of course, everything else that is need to be known is within this evaluation kit firmware with all the names and symbols. And what we can do now is we can use a specific Broadcom diagnostic protocol for the LMP monitor. That, again, needs another patch to the driver, but we already need to patch the Android driver, so it doesn't matter. It does not work out of the box, so we just have for a few Android versions, we have the patches, so Android 6, Android 7, and what is it, Lineage OS 14. I was doing those patches. And so it works for any device with a Broadcom chip running one of those 3 operating systems. Instead of having the assembly patch on Blues, it does not work because Blues is ignoring the diagnostic protocol type, and I still didn't get enough time to patch around this. But yeah, I can demo this. So this will be the first demo, if it works. So this one is full screen. And font is a bit too small. Huge. Wow. Okay, the project is really bad. Nope, nicht auf dem. Ich habe noch eine Idee, was ich mache. Was ich aber sollte tun.
Macht es nur kleiner.
Oh nein, doch?
Ah, doch.
Ja, that one works. Wow. Yep. So that's the first nice thing right now. So it's actually auto-detecting what firmware is running on my Android phone. So it's just loading everything, all features that are supported. And now I can say monitor start, like this. And then, yep, I can just do some scanning here. So it's like the point in time where you maybe want to turn off your Bluetooth. And yep, I should be able to do some stuff. That's great. So once again, should start some pairing. Yes. So that's the cool stuff here. You can see on the right-hand side that it's doing some LMP commands here. So it's just decoding everything you could imagine. So it's just the LMP. And the cool part here is that it's now also working for Bluetooth LE. So it's Bluetooth LE and classic Bluetooth. Before we just had LMP, now we have the LE lower layer too. Yeah. So that's the first part. So if you compile everything, it should look like this in the end. Pretty easy to use. One funny part here is that the MAC address is just 4 bytes because the first 2 bytes don't matter in Bluetooth. So if you do an L2 ping in Bluetooth, you can just leave out the first 2 bytes and you can reach the device. Yep. So that's it for the first demo. F11? F11 ist. Ach so.
Probieren wir mal F5.
Ah. Großartig. Das heißt, ich muss nochmal mein X antragen.
Musst du nochmal neu starten, die Präsentation.
Ja. Ja. Ah. Ui. Was kaputt gemacht? Wow.
Steht noch auf 1 eigentlich.
Das funktioniert auch nicht mehr.
Das funktioniert auch nicht mehr. Ja.
Okay, I think we broke it.
Ja, aber es schaltet auch nicht mehr um. Fuß irgendwie im Kopf. Jetzt wird es wieder kommen. Ah ja. Ah, jetzt bin ich auf 1.
Warte, jetzt muss ich ja nochmal X ran dran machen.
Das sollte gleich kommen.
Wie gesagt, HDMI2 disconnected in meinem X-Randra.
Geht das Kabel schon in dem?
Ja.
Jetzt sagt auch erst wieder dran.
Sagt immer noch HDMI2 disconnected.
Sollen wir dann direkt da reingehen?
Wenn du willst, kannst du einfach bei dir weiter präsentieren.
Das können wir auch machen.
Direkt? Ja, direkt. Wie wir mal. Ja, okay.
Dann schreiben wir nachher manuell um.
Oops, we crashed it. Yep. So back to the presentation. Yeah, so that was this part of the demo. Now everything about monitoring on a Broadcom chip is now independent from any assembly patches, and it should work on quite a lot of devices. So my list is pretty short right now. If you want to try it, I will also help you, and you can just write messages and make a GitHub issue and so on if you have questions. So, it's doing funny things with me. Yep. So there's pretty a lot of reasons why we really like Bluetooth or not. And Dennis is now going to tell you what are the... Oh, okay, I continue. Okay, so I also like Bluetooth a lot because it's really broken. So why do I like it? So first of all, even if you are not discoverable, it's always possible that someone can connect to you. So so you can just not be visible, but as long as I know your MAC address, I can just send a packet to you. And then of course you can say, yes, I do not want to like accept connections and so on. But first of all, it's not that you're not appearing in a scan does not mean that your phone is like blocking all requests. And that's pretty weird. And you can also do some sniffing in the air and then guess the MAC addresses. It's a bit more complicated than in Wi-Fi because of the hopping, but it's not impossible. And then people can just like get your Bluetooth MAC address and then do some connect, or can just say, hey, what's your LMP version? And that's pretty cool for Broadcom because then you just know which chip the person is running. And the next part is a so-called Nino attack. I think for that one, I will now just use not the live demo, but the video, because I'm a bit afraid of breaking the setup. So what happens in Nino is when you do a Bluetooth pairing, then you have two devices, and those two devices want to set up a secure connection. And if you want to do this, the only way to exclude that there is a man in the middle is that both devices say, we have a possibility to compare a number. So that's this 6-digit number that you see in a Bluetooth pairing. And you compare this, and then you exclude that there is a man in the middle. The problem with this is that the very first part of this connection where the devices say, yes, I have a keyboard, yes, I have a display, or I don't have any of this because I'm a headset, this part is not secured. I mean, how should it be? The devices don't know each other, they don't trust each other yet, they don't have any root of trust in common. So they just need to trust on the information if the other device has a keyboard, a display, and so on. And now the problem is that even though it is insecure to do a pairing without a numeric comparison, so there is nothing in the standard. So the standard just says, yes, this is insecure if there's a man in the middle which is actively exchanging things, but the operating system does not warn you. So this is really funny because you can just say on your own smartphone, like, I am not a smartphone having a display. Yes, I'm a smartphone, but I don't have a display. And then the other device will not warn you, but just instead of the number in the pairing, show you this yes-no option. Where is it? So what you can see here, I have this Nexus 5, which I use with a proof of concept script that's already online in the Git by now, which is just saying I don't have any I/O capabilities, so I cannot show you a number or cannot compare a number. The Nexus 5 itself does not forget that it can do it from this patch. So it's just telling this to the other device, which means that in the following, now the Nexus 5 on the left will show you a pin. So on the left, you can see a pin. But on the right, it just says, do you want to pair, yes or no? And if you're not aware of this, there might be a man in the middle. You don't know it. And it's something that the vendors should change, obviously. And it's a well-known attack. But maybe due to usability or something, I mean, we ignore certificate warning in the browser anyway. So why should we read it here? I don't know. So people just say yes, no, yeah, OK, go for it. Yeah. And then you can just say pair, and it's paired. Okay. Present. Okay. Yep.
Okay, so also as teaser already in the introduction, I tried to implement proof of concept for another security vulnerability that came out last summer. This one is called fixed coordinate invalid curve attack, and basically affects the pairing process, and to be exact, the Diffie-Hellman key exchange that happens during the Bluetooth pairing process. I will now quickly explain how this attack works, and then how this attack works, and later explain how I went to develop a proof of concept for this. So the fixed coordinate invalid curve attack, as already said, affects the key exchange. Bluetooth uses a elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman key exchange during the pairing sequence, and for this key exchange, you usually exchange 2 points on an elliptic curve as a public component. Then also what happens in this special case, because this is actually authenticated Diffie-Hellman key exchange, both of those components have to be authenticated. And this works, as already said, with this pin that you have to accept. So some of the components that were exchanged during the key exchange, there's a hash calculated over them. And then from this hash, you derive this pin and show this pin on both devices. And the user have to say, OK, both pins are actually the same. So that means that the hashes were the same. And that means that the components have not been modified by a man-in-the-middle attacker. Now, those Diffie-Hellman key exchange coordinates that are being exchanged are points on elliptic curves. So they have an x and a y coordinate. And in the Bluetooth standard, it's actually specified that only the x coordinate should be authenticated. So only the x coordinate actually affects the pin that is shown to the user. The y coordinate is not included in the hash that leads to the calculation of the pin. So this is for the Bluetooth standard. This wouldn't be a problem because the y coordinate actually depends on the x coordinate. So if the device receives an x coordinate, you have the curve equation. You can simply insert the x coordinate and calculate the y coordinate and see if you received the correct y coordinate. But of course, not all vendors did it like this, because this was not mentioned in the specification that you do to have this. So basically, some of the vendors out there didn't do the check and simply trusted the y coordinate that was sent over the air. And an attacker can simply mess with the y coordinate because it doesn't affect the pin at all. If you zero it out, for example, the pin will still be the same as before. And this has a problem because the y coordinate is still important. If the attacker, for example, is able to zero out the y coordinate in both directions, then both devices will continue to work with a 0 y coordinate, and this will lead to a predictable null key to be calculated. So if the attacker manages to find 2 vulnerable devices that want to pair to each other and does a man-in-the-middle attack and zeroes out those y coordinates, the Diffie-Hellman key exchange still succeeds because both devices can still calculate a key, but the attacker can predict this key and now also has the shared secret that both have shared during the key exchange. There are a little bit more implications to this attack. So it has to be that both the private keys of the devices have to be even. So this attack won't work in all cases. So it's a little bit non-deterministic. And yeah, I simply wanted to implement this to see if it actually worked. So my idea was that I didn't want to do a man-in-the-middle Bluetooth setup because this is still very hard, and I also didn't really want to attack somebody. What I was interested in a pen testing scenario, I wanted to see if another device, if I have to test this, is still vulnerable to this vulnerability. For example, I've pen tested car radios or similar IoT devices in the past, and I wanted to simply check if this device is still vulnerable to this vulnerability without digging into the firmware of this firmware again. So what I did is I add a patch to the Nexus 5, which simply emulates this man-in-the-middle attacker. So basically the patch does nothing else than zeroing out the Y coordinates in both directions once they are sent through this LMP protocol. And by doing this, I basically simulate an attacker that sits in the air and does this in the air. I just do it on this device directly to see if the other device detects this. And now if I pair my device with any other device and this still works, that means the other device does not check if the Y coordinate is still correct. And this is how I can check if other devices are vulnerable. And basically, because this is really non-deterministic, I recorded this as a video because it really sometimes takes a while to succeed, and I don't want to do that here. So we will see another video where I did that. Basically, I used the Nexus 5 with internal blue as the attacking device, and then I have a Nexus 7, which is also still vulnerable to this attack. By the way, the Nexus 5 is also still vulnerable to this attack, so I don't have to bypass any mitigations or something on the devices itself. On the left side, you can see my computer screen here, which runs the internal blue framework. On the right side, you have two devices. The bottom one is the Nexus 5, which is the attacking device, and the upper one is the Nexus 7, which is the victim in this case. The Nexus 5 is connected via USB to the computer to run the internal blue framework. Now, if we start the video, it's running. Should be. Yeah. So the first thing I do is starting a script I wrote that uses internal blue to basically patch things in the firmware. This will then cause that the Y coordinate is zeroed out on both directions. Then I start the framework and also the LMP monitor again so that we can actually see what's going on. Then I start a pairing process. Now you will see that on both devices, let's just wait here. I'm not sure if you can see that from the back, but I can assure you that on both devices, the pin that is shown is still the same. However, I zeroed out the Y coordinate, and we will later see that in Wireshark. I just let it continue now. If I pair those, you can see that the pairing actually succeeds. And now in Wireshark, we scroll back to the point where the key exchange happened on the LMP protocol. This happens in 3 steps. Because the key exchange is actually too large to happen in one single LMP packet. And here you can see the first packet. It's actually too small, I guess. However, the thing that is highlighted in blue there is the X coordinate, or better, the first part of the X coordinate. It's some random numbers that doesn't matter. Now, if I click on the next packet, you see the rest of the X coordinate and the beginning of the Y coordinate. And if you have good eyes, then you see that the second part of this highlighted thing is actually zeroed out. And the last packet will contain the rest of the Y coordinate and will actually be all zeros. Yeah, that's here. So you see that I have zeroed out the Y coordinate and the other device still accepted the pairing. So I know for sure that the Nexus 7 is vulnerable to this attack. And this is pretty helpful. Now I also tried the same thing with my Pixel 2 here. It still shows the same pin because the pin is not affected. However, the Pixel 2 actually checks if the Y coordinate was messed with, and so the pairing actually fails. So Pixel 2 is actually fixed against this vulnerability. Or I would have to try it more often because it could also be that the private keys were not even. So as I said, this attack is non-deterministic, and you have to try it a few times. But this already helped me in some pen tests to see if other devices were vulnerable and to actually find some vulnerable IoT devices. even without knowing which vendor this is. You can just do it over the air, pair with the device, and you know, okay, this one is vulnerable. Okay.
Yep. So since we have the firmware of quite a lot of Bluetooth chips, it's also interesting to look for bugs within the firmware. And actually, I stumbled over the first bug without even looking for bugs. I just was looking for functions. So when I went through all of this code, there is quite a lot of handlers, and the important part with the handlers is each handler is checking certain ranges. So each handler is looking up opcodes, or if it's HCI, it's looking, is it which command group am I in, and so on. And by these comparisons, you can in the end find out if something actually is a certain handler. And then there was this one handler that was really strange and missing this checks. So it's within other handlers, but there's this one strange handler not having any checks. And then I compared firmwares and so on, and I found out, so this was like patched in summer 2014. So they found out that there's this check which misses, but they never thought this could be relevant to security. I mean, it's just a missing, if it's just a missing range check, what should it be? And first of all, when I contacted Broadcom and said this really is an issue, they said like, ooh, this handler, it does not exist. So I said, it exists, you implemented your own funny stuff there. Then they said, yeah, but okay, then your attack is not standard compliant. Okay. Actually, so the last time I gave this presentation, I said my next exploit will be standard compliant. And yes, my next exploit is standard compliant, but not that severe. So yeah, at least I'm sending standard compliant packets. Not correct order, but I'm sending standard compliant packets. And they also said it does not affect Wi-Fi performance. That's something, well, maybe yes, maybe no. So they share a 2.4 gigahertz antenna, and whenever you do something that is strange, like restarting the firmware or something, then you restart scanning, and that really slows down Wi-Fi. So even if it's not something on a command or control level somewhere here, at least if you restart Bluetooth and the device again starts scanning, that slows down Wi-Fi. So what is this bug about? Well, first of all, there's quite a lot of devices that are vulnerable. So it's just a selection that I got by asking like my students, and it's hard to ask my students. So I asked them, can I try my new exploit against your machine? Can you please turn on Bluetooth? And they are like, what? No, never again. Not while you're here. But so this is the selection that I got with asking people if I could test it. Broadcom never gave me back a list of vulnerable devices, so I guess they didn't like me so much. But yeah. And what can it do? Well, it just restarts or crashes the Bluetooth. So the restarting is if the operating system realizes Bluetooth is gone, it might restart it. It depends on the configuration. And then Bluetooth is no longer doing things. That's pretty great. So the test that I used most of the time is just that I have some music running, which is then interrupted, but it also works without music. So it's just restarted. Yeah. So maybe that's the one that I'm going to demo. Does the demo work again? That's the big question.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Brauchen wir dann wieder das Kabel hier? Oder? Dann nimmt das Kabel.
Okay. So this is not the standard setup that I have here. So I applied a patch. Can you see that? That should be working. Yeah, look, I'm on the screen. Someone will do. Funny. So if I click connect to the other device, then ideally, if it's working, you should see Bluetooth restarting on the iPhone. Yep. So that's it. That's the crash. So who wants to be on the screen right now? I mean, I can now
Just
also
attack random
yeah,
people.
yeah. Who is this? Is this a vulnerable device? I don't know. Probably not. No, it's blocking. It responds differently. But yeah, so funny thing. Yeah. Now you might say, yeah, okay, it's just restarting Bluetooth. Who cares? Well, some people care, but it's actually more. And now I need my slides again. Yeah. Do I have the slides again? Takes a while. Does it crash? No, it doesn't crash. Okay. I didn't touch. He touched it, so it works. So. So the issue here is that we are actually jumping from one handler into the other handler. So best case is that I'm executing something that is no valid code or no valid address, and then it crashes. But compilers, they like to put handlers after each other. So you have the one handler, and then you have the next handler, and the next handler. And one of the next handlers happens to be HCI. And there is HCI test commands and stuff, so I can actually jump with some wireless whatever traffic into a handler that is HCI and only should be executed locally when I'm on the host. So what I'm able to do is that with this, I can also execute the test mode on the other device and say, yeah, you are now in test mode. So that's for the Nexus 5 chip, which is also in a few other devices. And I just say, you are now doing test mode, and then I can drain your battery, or I can make jam use certain frequencies in test mode, which are shared with Wi-Fi. So at least there, you will definitely have the problems in Wi-Fi. So we promised Broadcom to only publish the details in summer. So yeah, like 2-3 more months to go. The paper is accepted and so on, but yeah, so details will follow on this. But they rolled out patches recently. So the iOS 12.1.3 definitely is patched against this. So I have an older iOS on this iPhone here for the demo. But yeah, so you should always update your device. And I don't know if this very old chip is still going to be fixed. Maybe.
Probably not.
Maybe not, yeah, maybe not. And now the question is also, what can you do with this? So we try to explore things happening in there. And the most useful thing that Dennis added when I stumbled around this was adding trace points. So in the very beginning, I only had like, oops, it crashes, but what does it do? And Dennis added this very useful feature where you can say, I want to add a trace point. So for example, in the LMP dispatcher. And whenever I call this, or this one gets called, I get all registers printed out, and I can even dump the memory contents so that I have some idea of what is going on. And after this, the trace point will delete itself, so that if you're running something in a loop, that it's not blocking the complete firmware. Then I also set up something with Unicorn and Radar 2, which does some function calls and so on, and memory diffs. But it's very slow. There's also Jan sitting over there. I don't know, maybe he hides. Yeah, he did something that is a bit faster, just on QEMU base and so on. And then you get tons of traces that you can stare onto and try to find out what is going on for some strange behaviors. That's really great. So you can just stare on tons of information. Now, fixing bugs is pretty hard. So, I mean, as Dennis already said, probably they are never going to fix it for the older devices, because this firmware files, they need to go into your operating system, and then the operating system still needs to get updates, and who is updating a smartphone that is older than like 3 or 5 years? So this is pretty hard. So I came up with the idea to do a Bluetooth firewall. That one is also available as proof of concept by now. It's pretty funny, so you can just say I only want to accept connections with the MAC address from my headset, I mean, of course, still someone can try to sniff traffic and so on, but if you're just walking around without your headset, nobody should be able to connect. And I then saw it's actually crashing Apple's Bluetooth daemon. So that's why I gave them a bit more time, but they didn't respond so far, so I don't know. The fun part in the Bluetooth daemon is that this is trying to fix around stuff in the Broadcom drivers. So whenever there is something strange, then the Bluetooth D after a minute just decides to restart Bluetooth. So for example, if you now do a connection, so I establish a connection, then I would normally get an HCI event back, which is the connection was successful, or I couldn't connect because the device is not there. And what happens here is I send the connect request over HCI, and then the device is just saying LMP not accepted. So it's a message that is not expected there. Then the Broadcom firmware is not sending any HCI event back because LMP not accepted, you don't get it at this stage normally. And then there's no report back, it times out, no event, and just a restart. So not really some execution or something, it's more like a bug. And I think this bug also tells a lot about how stable this driver is. So whenever something is strange and I'm not getting the events that I expected, I just restart it because, yeah, I don't know what it's doing. So this vendor fixes are already being rolled out. That's pretty cool. But also these updates leak the vulnerability. So probably if you manage to extract the HCD file from the most recent smartphones and compare what Broadcom has been patching, you will be able what exactly is the handler to determine that what the handler is. So because these updates, they are not signed, they are not encrypted. It's the same mechanisms that we use for patching. You can probably find it. And the next funny part is that normally things are a bit outdated. So I said they closed the bug in 2014 in summer, but it was still in a MacBook from 2016 because the firmware on the chip is even older than some other stuff around it. So it's like around the same date of the datasheet probably. And then if you get a very recent device, there's typically a Bluetooth firmware on it that is 2 years old. That's not so nice, actually. If you have a very, very old chip, then these do not seem to be vulnerable, but probably they have other vulnerabilities. You never know. So that's it, and we still have a few minutes for Q&A.
Thank you very much. Thanks for this talk. Any questions? Where are the Bluetooth hackers?
Have you looked at any other chipsets? Or is there any plans to do that?
I have one chipset that I want to do, but the problem is most vendors do sign and so on their updates. So for most vendors, you cannot just do something within the firmware.
Yeah, so one of the reasons we choose Broadcom is because they made it really easy for us. There are those HCI commands they implement to read out memory and write memory, which is really nice for security researchers. And for other chipsets, we haven't found this yet, but we also haven't really looked into some of the others. I guess interesting, would be other devices like Apple devices and also like Intel chipsets because they're almost everywhere in the laptops. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so far, no.
Yeah, so to say. I mean, I have one where I have like leaked vendor-specific HCI commands, but that, yeah, I mean, my to-do list is long and I have a couple of students. Yeah, but at least there's very many devices who have a Broadcom chip, so it's like 20 or 30%. So getting a good support for the Broadcom chips is probably worth more than supporting like 10 different vendors.
All right, further questions? None? And thanks again very much. Very good talk.
Thank you.